I'd like to welcome everybody to this webinar on medical solidarity with Palestine, advocacy, ethics, and action. So my name is David Borshoff. I'm one of the founding members of Perth Doctors Medical Aid for Palestine. I'm also a consultant anesthesiologist, and I've recently spent some time in the West Bank. But before we start, I would also like to say that I'm a proud Australian, and I'd like to acknowledge the Whadjuk Noongar people of Boorloo, Perth, as the traditional custodians of the land from which I'm hosting this webinar. I'd also like to pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. So thank you all for registering and supporting our collective effort to bring both relief and justice to the Palestinian people. It's an absolute privilege to be moderating this webinar with the four amazing speakers that we have for you today. I will introduce Tirza Lebovitz, Nick Maynard, Leslie London, and Britt Swan in more detail when I call on them to speak. But before we start, I'd like to briefly touch on our agenda. We've all witnessed the destruction, the horrendous destruction of the Gazan healthcare system. Many of us have felt the urgency and responsibility to speak out. We've also experienced the frustration of being silenced or threatened for doing so. One of the worst aspects for many of us, me included, has been the deafening silence of our colleges and medical institutions. Many of us actually look to these for leadership and in times like this for moral authority. They continue to fail us, and this has been highlighted very recently by the cancelling of the Grand Round on children and war at the Royal Children's Hospital in Melbourne. So what can we do? Hopefully, after listening to these four speakers, we will be better informed, perhaps better networked, and maybe have a better idea of how we can make a difference in some small way and perhaps through better directed action. So now I would just like to make sure that everybody is on mute, and I'll introduce the first speaker. It is Tirza Lebovitz, who is an advisor on justice, politics, and rights. Her leadership is rooted in human rights law. She's known for working across coalitions, regions, and constituencies to implement real-world change. She brings global perspectives to support voices on the ground. But perhaps importantly, she's the Deputy Director of Physicians for Human Rights in Israel, and with B'Tselem has recently received significant media attention for being the first Israeli organizations to accuse the state of committing genocide. So really impressive and a delight to have Tirza with us today. And I'd like to hand over to Tirza now to speak to us.
Thank you very much. I'll say a word about Physicians for Human Rights Israel to position ourselves in this conversation, and through that also position ourselves vis-a-vis the Israeli Medical Association, the IMA. So Physicians for Human Rights Israel is a human rights organization. We are based in Israel. We have a staff of Palestinians and Jewish Israelis working together. We both provide direct medical service through particular clinics to the most disadvantaged groups, and we do a significant amount of documentation, investigations, advocacy on the rights to health with regard to everyone who is under Israel's control, which pretty much goes from the covers all those under Israel's responsibility or control. So since the start of the war, we have been documenting What I think most people kind of hear of and have in mind is the destruction of hospital by hospital in the Gaza Strip. What we have been doing is actually documenting multiple manifestations of the war on Gaza. And as we were doing this activity, so documenting the destruction of infrastructure, the killing of medical teams, the detention, mass detention of medical staff, the blocking of humanitarian aid, the blocking evacuation, led us, in addition to documenting each of these routes, to the report that David, you mentioned, which diagnoses the situation from our perspective. We're not the first ones. Others have done it before us, but we joined our voices and we gave a health analysis to diagnose the situation in Gaza, or Israel's actions, as a situation of genocide. Let me pull up my brief slides. Can you see the slides here? I want to stress that what we're going to be talking here on two levels. One is the actual violations on the ground by Israel's actions, but importantly, looking at what the IMA has done in response in order to understand whether the IMA has fulfilled its obligations, its ethical obligations. So this first slide here, the quote here is a quote that we can all identify with. The fact that the hospital serves 1 million residents, including vulnerable communities, and now cannot receive most incoming patients, highlights the grave humanitarian impact. This, of course, refers to the attack on a hospital. This is the only such statement by the IMA, and it was not about any of the hospitals attacked in Gaza, but about the Soroka hospital in the south of Israel, in Beersheba, which was attacked by Iranian missiles, which deserves condemnation, but it stands against the silence of the IMA with regard to multiple other destructions of hospitals with similar, precisely similar results, and even worse, because while Soroka was the only one that was attacked, obviously in Gaza, what we saw was that attacks of hospitals preceded the forced displacement of whole populations in areas of the Gaza Strip, and followed, preceded, and the forced movement of populations, ending with the destruction of the attacks on 33 of the 36 hospitals, the rendering of most of them inoperable, and only half of them only partially able to operate. So here we have for example, the Kamal Adwan Hospital in 2024, and recently the Nasser Hospital, caught, on camera, nowhere, to hide, and still the IMA did not respond to these attacks. The reason I'm highlighting this quote here is because of something that will recur in my presentation. That what comes, we will go through different kinds of responses or silence by the IMA, but overriding or overarching is a sense that the IMA puts the national identification and interests before human rights and ethical ones, which is the only explanation for responding in such a way to an attack on an Israeli hospital, and the silence with regards to the attacks elsewhere. Moving on to the next slide, here I'm just highlighting a very detailed piece that was published in the New York Review by Niv Gordon, who is a researcher and expert on health systems, Guy Shalev, who is the executive director of Physicians for Human Rights Israel, and Osama Tanus, who is a board member of the same organization. And in it, you can access it. If anyone who needs to get beyond the paywall, we can share that. We can share a PDF version. And I'm highlighting this because this article details much of what I'll be talking about here, and you can then review it. You can see most of what I'm talking about and more in detail in this article. And finally, just to refer to our genocide report, which you can find on our website, which analyzes the multiple forms of the destruction of the health system in Gaza, and how and on the basis of what do we conclude that what is happening is genocide. So now I'd just like to go to the main part, just in a few minutes, run through the different kinds of violations happening and where the IMA, what was the response or no response of the IMA. And again, I want to give one general comment, which is we will see here as we go through this quickly, the different kinds of either responses or omissions, in some cases silence, and in some cases following multiple approaches, usually by us, by PHRI, in some cases by its own doctors. We will see some responses. There have been some responses. What is common to all of this is that even when there are responses, it's in the form of a statement of either restating what appears in law or already appears in its own ethical regulations. And in no case was there any follow-up, any active step in response to these violations. So let's go to the first category here, which is the denial of medical care. Right at the top of the war on October 11th, 2023, and in several occurrences later on, months later as well, the Israeli health ministers ordered hospitals to deny treatment to Palestinian and then what it called Palestinian terrorists, which is a term that is used usually not judiciously, in other words, without distinction, for Palestinians who are brought in from Gaza or the West Bank. And several hospitals complied, and some of them did so publicly, in other words, announcing that they would not be receiving the Palestinians who are brought to it. Another form of the denial, or in the case of violation in medical care, is that when Palestinians were accepted, Israeli hospitals, hospitals, they were treated while fully restrained and blindfolded, and this is in breach of medical ethics, and in documented cases, discharged prematurely, contrary to accepted medical standards. Besides a statement after this, the announcements, the order by the Israeli ministers about this, and the warning about the breach of medical ethics in terms of how they're treated, the IMA came out with a statement, but there has been no follow-up, no investigation, no search, no researching what had happened, and no steps taken. Moving to the second category of doctors complicit in torture, and we can talk about two heads here. There is the famous Sde Teman military hospital, in which this has been broadcast around the world, very severe documentation of widespread torture and abuse involving doctors. So routine examinations of detainees while blindfolded and shackled, the medical neglect, like ignoring even urgent medical conditions. In some cases, doctors concealing their identity. In some cases, performing amputations without anesthesia. And with this, the data and the information coming in some cases through whistleblowers, the head of the chair of IMA's ethics committee actually participated in an ad hoc ethics committee visit to the Sde Teman camp, And coming out of there, rather than seeing a condemnation and steps taken to investigate, the statement claimed or gave voice to an assessment that the medical team treating the facility is one of the most ethical medical teams I have encountered. So no doctor was criticized and no investigation came forward from that. Parallel to the military camps, there has been widespread neglect and a spike in it in the prison system, in the non-military prison system, in terms of the many Palestinian prisoners there. And we're talking about a spike and hundreds of percentage spike in terms of deaths in custody of Palestinian prisoners and of medical neglect. And there's going to be a forthcoming report by our organization. Once again, IMA cover-up and no actual investigation. Going to the third category, we're looking at doctors' genocidal statements. The range is from individual doctors coming out with incendiary posts on social media, using terms like cockroaches and other dehumanizing language, through hospitals putting on their hospital social media doctors in military garb sending regards from the field. And this touches on another aspect to keep in mind, which is the very close relationship between the civil medical profession in Israel and the military. The fact that many senior posts in the civil medical profession are manned by officers, and so this creates an added obligation on the IMA to keep the distinction between, again, medical ethics that they have a mandate to promulgate and to ensure the implementation of, and other considerations, other interests, including state interests. I'm going to be wrapping up in the next 2-3 minutes, so I'll go quickly to the several other categories. We spoke about the restraint of patients. So coming to a category which I don't know how much receives public attention outside of Israel, and that is that even with regards to the IMA's own members, as you may know, the community of physicians, doctors in Israel is made up of 25% Palestinians who are citizens of Israel. And we have seen a very clear spike in terms of discriminatory hearings, of situations of firing staff, and overall silencing of these teams. I can usually the ground for such discriminatory hearings are absolutely, it's hard to believe that this was a response. Just to give an example of a senior head of the ICU unit in a hospital in the center of Israel, who was suspended on a day early on during the war in which there was an exposure, I'm putting quote unquote, of a photo with a green background with the Muslim Shahada, which is a religious verse that is said, claiming that this shows his support for Hamas, when it turned out that that photo was taken from a 2022, an old Facebook post. That did not help. He was later fired. That's one of, and this case actually came to the forefront of public attention, which also has a very silencing kind of effect. And then I will end by what we spoke about in the beginning, which is the failure to condemn the many attacks on Gaza's healthcare. And I'll mention here also the failure to condemn the killing and detention of healthcare workers. And I think you all know the figures. We're talking about 1,600 who have been killed and close to 400 who have been detained. 100 are still there. Several died in custody. Several are actually missing. In other words, we do not know what their situation is. And not once did the IMA take actual action. This moves me to the final part of my presentation, which is a quote here that again I think represents the character of some of the responses by IMA. And here is a response that was received by Jewish Belgian doctors who turned to the IMA with a demand of the IMA to condemn the targeting of healthcare workers. And as we see here, the response actually is a parroting, right? It's actually taking on the role of the military to say that by definition, whoever finds themselves harmed are terrorists. So they somehow, doctors here, right? The IMA has taken the role of determining that those hit were terrorists and promulgating this kind of narrative. So why should the Australian or any medical association put pressure on the Israeli medical establishment? I think saying the obvious, I think it is, it is the mandate of health organizations who are, united by a common ethical agenda and also by common international institutions to put red lines if a member is crossing them. I'll also add, as someone from Israel and who knows the community here, that the Israeli medical community is susceptible to international pressure. The ability to attend conferences, the ability to participate in the international community is something important. Just this year, the Sheba Hospital was announced as number 8 in the world in terms of hospitals. That's something that the medical community here is proud of, and that creates ability to put pressure. This not less important is the fact that by putting pressure on the Israeli medical establishment, that constitutes support and solidarity with those members who are silenced within the medical profession. And finally, and maybe most importantly, is that the Israeli medical community, and specifically the IMA, holds a powerful position in Israel. The IMA does not only have a mandate of creating internal ethical conduct, but it also sees itself as a mediator of these ethical conducts vis-a-vis the world. I can mention that several WMA heads were also heads of IMA. We have currently a member of the council of the WMA is a current IMA, so these connections exist. So what do we ask for? And ask for your help and support. I would say that, first of all, to say that, as you can tell from my presentation, what we're talking about, the grounds are human rights-based and ethics-based. We are asking for pushing out more resolutions, similar to some that have been already passed, and we'll hear about the likes of the British Medical Association resolutions. Statements, just statements about violations are not enough. The resolutions need to actually articulate clear demands of the Israeli Medical Association, whether through National Medical Association resolutions or putting pressure through the WMA, with consequences that the Medical Association can then consider. I'll stop here and I'll pass it on. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Tet. It's where I think many of us are aware of some of the stuff that's happening, but it's always shocking to hear it in forums like this. And I just want to say we've had a recent success in terms of some of the last points you were making. The Perth Doctors Medical Aid for Palestine, in fact, in shutting down a conference in Perth with a IDF associated speaker. So that was sort of encouraging for us to keep active in what we're doing. I'd just like to make the point that people are sort of putting their hands up to ask questions. Can we just put those questions in the chat and we might address them later? But we're not going to have time to interrupt the speakers and to pose questions in between. So I just want to thank you again, Fitz. That was really informative. But in the interest of time, I'm going to move straight on now to Professor Nick Maynard, who is a consultant gastrointestinal surgeon at the Oxford University Hospital. And he's renowned for his many trips to Gaza from 2010 right up to today. And as far back as January in 2024, he's been speaking out and speaking to the media about the dire humanitarian situation and the devastating collapse of the healthcare system in Gaza. He's also highlighted the deliberate targeting of doctors, nurses, and healthcare workers and hospitals by the IDF. But more recently, he's on record telling the media of the IDF shooting Palestinians at aid points like a game of target practice. So I'm sure Professor Maynard's career is illustrious and long, but I'm just going to hand over to him now to take the microphone. Thank you very much.
Thank you, David. Can I confirm my screen is being shared? It is. Brilliant.
It is being shared.
Thank you very much for asking me to join this really important webinar. I'm going to start off by showing a picture of Tarek Abdel Jawad, who's a medical student we've managed to get to join us in Oxford at Oxford University for his final medical year. And this is a comment he made when I first met him, describing a time in October 2024, just after October the 7th, when he was a fourth-year medical student, and he described his first shift at the emergency department at Al-Aqsa Hospital in Gaza. And I'll quote, "I had been already assigned to a mentor with whom I went to the Tent of Martyrs to count how many were dead in a recent airstrike on a residential area. What we found in a plastic bag was only body parts, mostly children's. I remember both of us counting how many eyes, ears and brains were there to confirm the number. It was estimated at 15 martyrs, a whole family, we assumed." The medical students, I've been out to Gaza on 3 trips since October the 7th, but many trips prior to October the 7th. And everywhere I've worked since October the 7th, we have had medical students with us, still trying to learn their craft, still trying to train as doctors so they can then treat their fellow Gazans. And we saw a picture of Nasser Hospital being bombed just in the previous speaker. That actually is where, in the middle picture, where I was living for a month when I was there very recently on the 4th floor, and that was the area that was bombed. On the right, you can see a group of medical students who I was teaching on my last trip to Gaza just a few weeks ago. And 2 of those medical students were killed in that bombing 3 weeks ago when the Israeli military bombed Nasser Hospital, saying they were targeting Hamas militants. Of course they weren't. They were targeting the roof of the intensive care unit, the roof of the theatre complex, killing journalists and, as I said, killing 2 medical students. Sorry, I'm just trying to advance. And of course, the Israeli military have been bombing hospitals for many years. This is a great hero of mine, a great friend of mine, Hamis Alessi in Gaza, an inspirational doctor. And he used to run the Al Wafa Medical Rehabilitation Hospital, which supported Gazans with severe spinal cord or brain injuries, predominantly, not exclusively, but predominantly from war trauma. That was bombed and destroyed in Operation Protection Edge in 2014. And the picture on the right is me taking a photo of Hamis standing where his office had been in that hospital when I entered Gaza just after that war had finished. So let me remind you, this targeting of healthcare infrastructure, this targeting of healthcare workers preceded October the 7th, has been going on for many years. We know all the figures, don't we? We know that more than 1,600 healthcare workers have been killed. We know that more than 450 healthcare workers have been abducted, tortured, many of them killed. Every hospital's been targeted. They say that 18 out of 36 hospitals are now partly functional, but a partly functional hospital in Gaza may mean little more than applying field dressings in times of extremis. And one of the doctors killed is that gentleman in the top right-hand picture, sitting at the back of the wall with his back. That's in my kitchen in Oxford. Maisara Al-Rais, killed on November the 8th, 2023, just after the beginning of this military assault. And his body has still not been discovered. His body is still buried under the rubble, as are the many thousands of Gazan civilians and healthcare workers. The healthcare system, as we know, has been almost completely disabled. There's been no electricity for 2 years, and they have been reliant upon local supplies of fuel. When the fuel runs out, the ventilators can't be powered up, so patients on ventilators die. When there's no fuel, the incubators can't be powered, so newborn babies in incubators die. And you'll all remember the story of Al Nasser Pediatric Hospital when the Israeli ground forces went in, forcing the healthcare workers to leave, and they didn't have time to evacuate the newborn babies in the incubators. And the doctors there were told they would be looked after. When they re-entered several weeks later, they found the bodies of 6 neonates rotting in incubators because they had not been powered and had not been looked after. There are often no drugs. We treated many patients most days without any painkillers at all. I can still hear the screams of the children as we treated them in the emergency room without any anaesthetic at all. Often no blood products. We often ran out of surgical gloves, surgical dressings, sterile drapes. Triage often collapses because of the overwhelming volume of work. And it's worth reminding you that they had been making wonderful strides forward in healthcare in Gaza prior to 2023. I'm a cancer surgeon in Oxford. I've been going out for some years to help them develop some of their surgical cancer services. And they'd even built a standalone cancer hospital, the Turkish Cancer Hospital. I cannot overstate the significance of that hospital being built, the recognition of the need to centralize cancer services, the plans to put in linear accelerators to provide radiotherapy. This was a massive step forward for the Gazan healthcare system. And of course, then this happened. Yet another hospital being destroyed by the Israeli military assault. And of course, Al-Shifa Hospital, we heard our previous speaker talk about this iconic hospital, older than the State of Israel, built in 1947, a place where I've taught medical students, worked for many years, a truly iconic hospital, which has been destroyed not once, but twice. And the last destruction last year, really destroying it completely. And that means not just going in and bombing the hospital. It means the military, the Israeli ground forces going in, destroying every single dialysis machine, going in and cutting the cables of every single portable ultrasound scanning machine, going into the laboratories, dismantling the laboratories, destroying the water tanks, destroying the sewage facilities, destroying the gas supplies. And when they left the hospital, and the Gazan healthcare workers went back into Shifa, they found the bodies of 300 Palestinian civilians dead, most of them handcuffed, most of them with bullet wounds in the head. And you can see the pictures of Shifa Hospital there, including these two doctors, Dr. Ahmed Makadma, a young plastic surgeon whom I worked with briefly in May 2023 when I was there, and his mother, who was a physician in Shifa Hospital. They were both discovered shot in the head with their hands handcuffed behind their backs. They'd been executed by the Israeli military. And of course, there are many stories of detention and torture. On the right there is Haitam, a friend of mine. He didn't want his face shown because he was fear of reprisals. He was abducted, illegally detained. He was abducted from Nasser Hospital, detained for 60 days. On the left is Sari, an operating theatre nurse I worked with at Al-Aqsa Hospital. He was abducted from the Indonesian hospital, detained illegally. Both of these individuals were tortured every day for 60 days. They both gave me video and video and audio testimonies, which I have given to the International Criminal Court. They described being kept naked, being kept handcuffed, blindfolded, beaten every single day, sometimes for 12 hours at a time. Electric shocks being passed through their genitals, dogs being set on them. They were psychologically tortured. They were told their families had all been murdered. I could go on, unspeakable tortures. And this document is available on the internet. It's deeply distressing reading, but essential reading if you want to know what's going on. Produced by Healthcare Workers Watch, two of whom were doctors from Oxford who I've been taking out to Gaza for many years. And they describe, this was published a year ago, they described that then over 1,000 healthcare workers had been killed and 264 cases of detention, many more than those now. And this document was the basis for the film. I say BBC film, I should strike that out because of course the BBC refused to show it in the end. It was commissioned by the BBC. It was shown by Channel 4, the film Gaza Medics Under Fire, which is based on the information in this document. And they talk about iconic orthopedic surgeons like Dr. Adnan Albert, who sought shortly before he was abducted and imprisoned. He was interviewed and said that practicing medicine has become a crime and the penalty for saving people's lives has become detention and being tortured to death. Shortly after then, he was indeed abducted and imprisoned, and he was tortured, and he was tortured to death. And this Sky journalist interviewed fellow detainees and reported in great detail how he had been tortured daily, he had been raped daily until he was killed by the Israeli military and prison service. And this document, I can't read these out because it's so distressing. They describe in great detail all the different forms of torture that have been documented, detailed and evidence as ways of healthcare workers who have been tortured in Israeli prisons. And they describe the systematic torture and abuse of Palestinians. Many examples of targeting specifically the external genitalia in males. And most worryingly for us as medics, the medical neglect, the medical negligence, and evidence of connivance and participation in the torture with some of the Israeli healthcare workers. So Gaza, we know, has been failed. I could give another talk on the way it's been failed by our governments, by our media, but it's also been failed by our academic and medical institutions. The BMA, and I'll talk a bit about them because they have latterly have improved their stance, the General Medical Council, the Royal Colleges in England, the universities, the hospital trusts. And again, we're all aware of the profound hypocrisy and double standards when talking about Gaza and Ukraine. We know that the Israeli Medical Association has failed in its ethical obligations in failing to denounce the systematic targeting of Gaza healthcare workers and facilities and the detention and torture and murder of healthcare workers. The support of military aggression through their collaboration with the Israeli state authorities and legitimizing the actions of the Israeli government. The BMA has improved its stance, and you'll be aware of this, and I'm sure we're going to come back to this. So I'll simply remind you that in the annual meeting just 2 months ago, there was an 81% majority who voted to suspend engagement with the Israeli Medical Association until it affirms medical neutrality and condemns attacks on healthcare in Gaza. And on the right summarizes the motions that passed. I will leave it there, but I know we'll come back to that in the discussions. Thank you very much for listening to me.
Thank you, Nick. Absolutely astonishing content and quite frankly, an affront to our humanity. It's really difficult to listen to. I'm sure people will have some questions, and if they have, they can hopefully put it in the webinar chat. But Nick, thanks again. And I'm going to move on now to Professor Leslie London. And Professor London is the chair of Public Health and Family Medicine at the University of Cape Town. He also heads the school's Health and Human Rights program, has served on many committees dealing with ethics and human rights in research and in professional contexts. He's a member of the National Health Research Ethics Council for the Department of Health, serves on committees for the International Commission on Occupational Health, collaborated on international guidelines for protection of patient rights in context of high-risk closed institutions. I haven't really done his career justice with that brief bio, but in a nutshell, his CV is extensive, and he's obviously one of those very committed and busy contributors to healthcare and human rights. And on that note, I'd like to introduce Professor Leslie London.
Okay, thanks very much, David, and to colleagues, and thank you so much for inviting me. And I stand in awe of Nick and other surgeons and doctors who continue to do amazing work in Gaza at incredible odds. I'm a South African. I'm a Jewish South African, actually, and have been active in standing up for rights of everyone, because never again means never again for everyone. I've been part of various organizations, some of which have done something. South African government, for instance, went to the ICJ, but I'm talking about professional organizations, and I've become very involved with trying to think through what you do when your organization refuses to speak up about genocide. One of the organizations I belong to is a organization of occupational and environmental health scientists whose mandate is to bridge the gap between research and policy, and get policymakers to understand the value of scientific research. And it's been very critical and independent. It's valued its independence and ability to look at power and injustice. It's issued a number of statements since 2019, includes 2 statements defending victimized scientists in USA and Turkey, and a statement on Russia's war in Ukraine. And as you can see, the statement was very strong in condemning Russia's war, Russia's acts of terror against civilians, targeting of civilian infrastructures, healthcare facilities. We condemn attempts to destroy Ukraine's cultural heritage. We condemn Russia for its devastating damage to Ukraine's environment. And as advocates for global health, we condemn Russia's use of food as a weapon. But when it comes to Gaza, the organization issued a very, very bland 87-word statement, which basically recognizes war as a public health crisis and calls on against the escalating violence. There's no mention of attacks on healthcare, killing of health workers, destruction of civilian infrastructure, the enormous impact on the environment, and the use of power and food as a weapon of war. This was early in the war, so a number of members of the organization felt that, well, given that how things are deteriorating, we need a stronger position. And initially we were told, we will discuss it in the executive response. And then we got a response saying another statement would not be effective and no audience exists for further remarks on this topic. And for the next 20 months or so, this has been the repeated pushback. As the situation got worse and worse, we doubled down on efforts to try and get the organization to respond. And the main response we had was the unity of the organization was most important. So despite a mission to protect life and promote public health, we were told that actually it's divisive and we can't go there and we should stay in our lane. We did get a session at the annual meeting of the organization, October 2024. It was a complete disaster because it was prefaced by a set of interventions which we had no control over. The speakers were changed by the organizers, and it was essentially an activity that happened so that the council could say, well, we've done something, we've had this discussion, now it's behind us. But of course, as things continued to deteriorate, there's absolutely no way we could stay silent. And so we organized basically a pressure from membership. And we got into a discussion about a compromise statement, which was not ideal, but it was one which certainly called for Israel to stop what it is doing now, starvation. It called for accountability under the ICC and ICJ, and it called for free access to humanitarian aid, UNRWA's restoration, and protection of health workers. And the vote, amongst those who voted, over 80% of members supported this resolution. So it was quite a revelation that actually the membership were far, far, far ahead of the leadership. It's still not clear whether the organization will entertain frank and open discussion, but I think we learned two things: that sustained pressure has to stay there, even if it seems like the leadership are going to resist. Also, I think that perhaps the perfect is the enemy of the good, and if we had a compromise statement which got widespread support, I've also seen that in my own university, so perhaps there's a strategic discussion to be held there. I'm now going to switch a little to talk about medical associations. So I come from South Africa. The Soweto uprisings in 1976 and the torture to death of Steve Biko, a political activist, in 1977 were sort of seminal events for us. There was a medical complicity by state doctors. Steve Biko was tortured to death in detention. He basically sustained a subdural hematoma after he was smashed against the prison bars by interrogators, and doctors were called in who essentially covered up his condition. He had a brain, upper motor neuron lesion, and they wrote a false report. He subsequently died. There was huge outrage globally. The Medical Association of South Africa actually had withdrawn from the World Medical Association in 1976 already because of diplomatic pressure on it, and South African delegates had not been able to attend two of the World Medical Association assemblies. Ironically, it was the American Medical Association that campaigned to readmit South Africa in 1980, and South Africa was finally readmitted in 1981. There was a lot of dissatisfaction in the World Medical Association. 1985, the BMA withdrew in protest, and there was a group called the Toronto Group, which were medical associations from a number of countries that came together. And the World Medical Association significantly suffered. Its membership had dwindled because of its position on South Africa. By 1985, there were only 35 national medical associations members of the WMA. And because of the Toronto Group and this pressure, there were some changes in the WMA, which adopted changes to basically give more voice to smaller associations, to reduce the power of the AMA and others, and also including the principle of independence of national medical associations. And most national associations returned to the WMA by 1995. South Africa then transitioned to a democratic state. But there was another precedent. In 1970, South Africa and the then Rhodesia were expelled from the Commonwealth Medical Association for racist policies in the country that were inconsistent with the multiracial character of what was seen to be the family of Commonwealth nations. And it was said at the time a compromise resolution, which was to ask for more information before taking a step, was defeated because it was felt then that if immediate action were not taken, then the CMA might break up. I flag this just for our discussion about what national medical associations might do in relation to the WMA. There is some history behind this. So as Nick has said, the BMA did adopt a set of resolutions on the 24th June, most importantly, suspending engagement with the IMA until it affirms medical neutrality and condemns attacks on healthcare in Gaza. As I understand, this was long in preparation and lobbying, and people worked very hard and very carefully to get this adopted. But it's happening elsewhere. We've heard about the Belgian doctors who wrote. I know the Tunisian Medical Association wrote to the WMA in July to urge the WMA to open an independent investigation into the role of the IMA and consider its suspension unless and until it takes a clear stance in support of human rights and medical ethics. Those of us in South Africa are working with the South African Medical Association to approach other national medical associations in Africa. the WMA presidency is soon to be taken by the Kenyan Medical Association, and there are other associations who are indicating interest in supporting some kind of global position on this. Besides national medical associations, there are other global organizations to which we all belong. I want to refer first to the Lancet editorial that came out earlier this year, which commented on how Gaza has been failed by silence and impunity. I think that really summarizes a lot of what we are feeling. Our organizations, whether they are medical associations or professional bodies, have been silent. But there are some that have spoken out. The European Public Health Alliance and the World Federation of Public Health Associations has issued a joint statement referring to the overwhelming and growing body of evidence pointing to the systematic targeting of civilians' health and education and an ethical duty to speak out. There is a community social pediatrics organization which has clearly stated a call for stopping the genocide. And the International Society for Environmental Epidemiology has, the president issued a statement in which he called for urgent action to halt what was going on and standing in solidarity. These are all examples of where members of these international organizations have persuaded their leadership to stand up and to stand up clearly. I would just refer you also to one organization called Academics for Peace, which is US-based, but it has participation from academics across the world, which is really a place where evidence-based comments are assembled and packaged into short videos. It's a fantastic site to use to get information and to use for social media and other campaigning. I'm on there talking about exactly what I'm saying here, about what to do when your organization refuses to speak out against injustice. There's Doctors for Genocide. And following our previous seminars, you'll see the image on the right, where we basically set up a platform for people to come together to talk about what to do. We have started a list server, Speak Up for Justice, which anyone is welcome to join. If you send me an email, we'll add you, where we try and share experiences and positive examples of what we can do to get our organizations to speak up. There is also national organizing. The American Public Health Association, I work in public health, so I know this, issued a very weak statement. Public Health Association of my country hosted a session at our conference, but is long in delaying a statement. And as has been said, very few organizations, certainly in the US, have said anything, and in Australia, this has recently also been published in The Lancet, where none of the specialist professional bodies condemned the Israeli government actions for what is happening now. But we know prevention of genocide is a public health challenge. And at this very moment, I know the Australian Public Health Association is considering a resolution which will come up at the AGM tomorrow. And some of you in the audience might be able to get involved and assist. And if you do want to get involved, please contact the organizers and we can put you in touch with the Australian public health people. My last slide is really just a reflection on what we've experienced in this process of trying to push our organizations and what do we like to encounter. The Israeli propaganda service internationally is well funded, and whenever you try to issue a statement, you will come up against people who you've never heard of before, but writing in and trolling you. I think some of the issues raised are really not worth debunking. The claims of burnt babies and decapitated corpses that get trotted out are just so out there, it's not worth trying to convince anyone because those will just be repeated. I think there are some important points we have to acknowledge in our responses. October the 7th, there were war crimes against civilians in Israel, and that has to be acknowledged. That's a starting point, and that's what the ICC has said. There are some strategic issues to address. This never verified claim that Hamas uses health facilities for human shielding. There's a lot of debunking. I think Nick mentioned, or Teresa mentioned, Nevi Gordon's work. But even in the context where, if there were to have been the use of a hospital, the Israeli response has been completely unlawful. And Len Rubenstein at the site Think Global Health has done a very excellent analysis of why that is an unsupportable claim. Then, of course, we get the pushback that this is a political issue and we are health professionals and we're not supposed to deal with politics. Well, there are a few responses. Firstly, the World Health Organization convened an entire commission on social determinants of health, basement of those social determinants. You can't address health unless you look upstream. There's a social science, and politics is nothing else but medicine on a large scale. He had a lot of foresight because this is what we are seeing now. Thirdly, there's an abundance of scientific and legal evidence to show this is directly germane to our healers, scientists, and health workers. If we concentrate on the ethics, the professionalism, and the human rights, there's absolutely no reason not to address this. And if we believe in multilateralism, and there are only a few dictators in the world who don't, we should support the ICJ and the ICC. Of course, there's the hoary element, in the room. Anti-Semitism will get thrown up, but I'm tired of having not anti-Semitic to support the right of everyone to human dignity, and that should be where we proceed. Thanks.
Well, thank you very much, Professor London, and that was very helpful, particularly for me, looking at some of the contents of those slides and after our brief email exchange before this webinar. And when I was expressing my frustration with my own Australian Society of Anaesthetists and the Anaesthetic College and their reluctance to make a statement or to be a little more active in this field, which many of us in that specialty have found very disappointing. But I appreciate you putting up all of those links, and that's something that we will take full advantage of. Now, I'd like to just move on to our last, but certainly not least speaker, Dr. Britt Swan. She is a young doctor at Perth Children's Hospital. She's also a Fulbright scholar and has recently completed a Master's of Public Health at Harvard. She's primarily interested in equity, child rights, and climate change, and feels the moral responsibility of defending medical ethics, particularly from the privileged positions we hold with the ability to call out injustices. More recently, she developed a degree of fame by publishing a much cited letter in the Lancet Journal, highlighting the selective ethics of the World Medical Association and the Israeli Medical Association. So I'd like to thank you very much for joining us, Britt, and I'll hand over the microphone to you now.
Thank you so much. And I'm very, very humbled to be here amongst such amazing speakers. I feel like my contribution has been relatively small, but I really would like to show that even if you're quote unquote just a junior doctor, there are very legitimate contributions you can make, and I'll just step through how I did those. So yeah, my name's Britt. I'm a junior doctor from Borley, Perth. I just graduated from an MPH, and I wrote an article in the Lancet about the selective ethics of the WMA and the IMA, as we've heard today. The whole journey was inspired by a Palestinian doctor on a webinar that I attended in the US. And it was Dr. Asaid Alsa, who is a Palestinian plastic surgeon, and he was expressing his deep shame and disappointment in the medical community in their lack of action to stand up for colleagues. And after that, I was like, I have to do something. And that's kind of what led me to writing that article. So I'm just going to do an overview of the destruction of Gaza's health system for people who might not know in so much detail, and then talk about the World Medical Association, the importance of speaking out even as junior doctors, and what we can do. So some key facts to mention: the UN describes this as a targeted destruction. As we've heard already, there's been over 1,600 healthcare workers killed, over 700 attacks on hospitals, ambulances, Red Cross tents since October 7th. UNICEF is describing this as a war on children because of the sheer number and proportion of children who are killed is unparalleled compared to any other conflict in living memory, with one child killed every hour since October 7th. This year alone, there's been a 500% increase in acute child malnutrition, with aid sites being cut from 400 to 4, with 3 of those being in the south on the other side of a militarized zone, which means that there is oxygen, medical aid, incubators, baby formula sitting on the other side of the border, unable to get in. And Israel, as the occupying power under international humanitarian law, has the responsibility to ensure that the rights of Palestinian people are upheld. Something that's really important to me is the Palestinian voices. And I recently listened to a speech by James Elder. It's on YouTube if you want to go listen to him. He's the UNICEF spokesperson. He's amazing. He's been speaking to children in Gaza on his trips there. And a lot of them, there's 90% literacy rate in Palestine before the war. So a lot of kids know about their human rights and their obligations. And he would ask them, what do you think? What do you feel about your human rights being violated in this war? And he said that they'd reply to him and say, those rights don't apply to us as Palestinians. We don't feel like human rights apply to us. And I think that goes to show the sentiment of Palestinians and the whole generation as well. So I approached this from a medical ethics and a human rights background. It was sparked by webinars such as the Dr. Asaid Alsa, also by other role models like Dr. Safia Abbas, who has also written about Australia's moral failure in leadership. And also by a friend in the US. I was attending an event in the US for Peaceful Action for Equity and Rights. And she said, oh, it's always nice to see white people here because as a person of color, I feel like people of color are disproportionately represented at protests for equity and rights. And that really made me reflect on the number of privileges that I have, including the fact that I'm white, English speaking, I have an Australian passport, I have a medical degree, which affords me some degree of being considered a trusted voice in society, and then also a degree of economic security, which just, I think, demonstrates that we have a moral imperative to act. And if not now, then I genuinely don't know when we would start to act. So that was an important reflection for me. Yes, this is Safia Abbas's article and the webinar itself. I'm just going to briefly touch on the experience of being in the US pre and post Trump administration. Pre-Trump administration on campus, there were many talks, courses, and open discussions about the treatment of Palestinian people and also Jewish identity, Palestinian identity. And then post-Trump administration, there was a noticeable tightening on this. There were events cancelled, courses dropped, some professors were dismissed, activists detained by ICE, police on campus. And it wasn't just Palestine, of course, it was also climate change, diversity, equity, inclusion. We're seeing in Australia, there are some similarities being mirrored with doctors losing positions and webinars being quietly or not so quietly cancelled now. And I'm not saying that what's happening in the US is happening in Australia, but I'm saying that these spaces for open discussion like we're having today are so important, and they can rapidly close if we don't defend them. So I think another point is standing up for our colleagues who are being silenced. Okay, so I'll briefly speak about the World Medical Association. The World Medical Association was formed, as we've heard, after World War II to defend medical ethics. So far, they've released 5 statements and a resolution, but there's been no explicit condemnation of the Israel state or mention that these attacks are deliberate. There is a call to the Israeli government for action. There is a condemning the attacks on Nasser Hospital. There is a call for the whereabouts of health professionals who have been detained to be made known. But there is no direct condemnation of Israel or mention of the deliberate nature of these attacks. Even if there were, these would just be statements and not necessarily actions. That's not just quite shocking, but it's also incongruent, as we've heard, with other conflicts such as the Russia-Ukraine conflict and the Iranian strike on the Soroka Health Center, which was described as deliberate, and the state was named. Selective ethics weakens not only the right to health in Gaza, but the credibility of international medical ethics for current and future generations as well. The British Medical Association, again, as we have heard, has been starting to lead action, and they've recently written this letter to the World Medical Association asking for stronger action. What I'd like to do now is to try and coordinate action between the national medical associations. I'll reach out to you, Prof. London, because we can maybe work together and push the national medical associations from lots of different countries to act together, because I believe that with collective action, they're more likely to take a stance. I've been drafting template letters that individuals or advocacy organizations can send to their National Medical Association to apply pressure, and gathering evidence so that everybody's not having to start from scratch in their country when they're advocating, just that they have kind of template documents and evidence. So if you're interested in, I guess, helping or assisting me with this type of campaign, I can pop my email in the chat later. Because I believe that in collective action, there's also power, but we're also more protected. So here I've just written a couple of points. If you're someone like me and you feel like you have little power, I think we're told that action is futile, and it's definitely a lie and it's not true. And we can do lots of things, including sending letters, joining local advocacy groups, donating, writing articles or op-eds, and defending those doctors who have been silenced or calling out silencing. I think if I have any words of advice, if you have any skills like writing, then write, or if you have financial resources, then donate, and like even little things count, even if you're someone like me, just a junior doctor. So thank you. I hope you feel like you both have a moral imperative to act, and then also something that you can do about it. You can reach out to me at any time, and yeah, I'll hand over to question time now.
Thanks for the presentation. It was, I love the content. I love your enthusiasm. And I find it really encouraging that not just a junior doctor, but an important, courageous young doctor is standing up and getting involved and networking and making contacts, because I think that's really important in moving forward and collectively bringing some sort of justice to the table. So thank you very much. Well done. This is to Nick. As a fellow surgeon, I find myself wondering, did you ever think you would be giving evidence to the ICC? What do you think prepared you for this act of bearing witness?
No, I had absolutely no idea. To be honest, I'll be doing anything like this. I mean, I've been going to Gaza for many years, since 2010, and it was a really sort of wonderful part of my life and all of those that went together. But it was a very sort of compartmentalized part of our life. We went there for a week, maybe twice a year. The rest of the time, we just got on with our normal lives. And of course, that's changed completely in the last 2 years. And it sort of dominated many of our lives because of what's going on. But it just seemed the most, for all of us, I think, those of us that love Palestinians, is the people that really do it for me. It just seemed the most natural thing in the world to carry out the advocacy, and having had the privilege of going out there to work for many years, but particularly since October the 7th, and help them. I think that we have a duty to advocate, to share our eyewitnesses, what we've seen, and tell the world what's going on, because no one else is telling the world what's going on. And therefore, going to the ICC was an inevitable part of that. So it just rolled on from what I believed, for me personally, to be an absolute duty to advocate and tell people what's going on.
Great, thank you. Thanks, Nick. And I would second that. On a personal note, I had nowhere near the same experience, but briefly went on a medical mission to the West Bank in November last year, and I was actually humbled. And I was actually humbled by the warmth and openness and affection shown to me by the Palestinian people. And I was also touched by how grateful they were that we were acknowledging, recognizing, and contributing to them. That's really stuck with me and is one of the driving forces for going back. There's a question. Sorry.
So just to add to that, and just maybe to expand a bit on, it has been a great privilege working with the Gaza and the West Bank healthcare workers when I've been there, but they are the truly the most inspirational, heroic people I've ever had the privilege of meeting, and how they have managed to cope with working under those circumstances the last 2 years is utterly beyond me. And the single most important thing that makes me continue doing all of this is the inspirational people I've worked with there and had the great privilege of getting to know and love.
Yeah, thanks, Nick. Look, there's another question here that I want to address to all the panel from an anonymous attendee. Why do you think our colleges and bodies won't speak up? Do you think it's pressure from pro-Israel doctors, fear of legal action, fear of being labelled anti-Semitic? Any thoughts on that? I mean, anyone wanting to speak up?
I'll talk about in the UK. I think there are several reasons. I think the predominant one is that of cowardice, and I think the weaponization by Israel of the accusations of anti-Semitism has stopped so many people from speaking out, and I think it's predominantly cowardice. I think with some people there's malice as well. There's clearly some ideology as well, but for most people I've come across, I think it's probably predominantly cowardice.
I just want to say that we actually invited all the college presidents to this webinar, and just not surprisingly, those who replied all had prior engagements. Did you want to comment on that?
I actually wanted to mediate, just to Britt, your point, your suggestion to work on statements to create templates. I just think concrete, programmatic ideas like this, I think would be so welcome. And I'm speaking and want to mediate to you how it looks on the Israeli side when rather than a general kind of condemnation of the Israeli government comes through versus a statement, a resolution that demands something of the IMA and says what are what might be the repercussions of not fulfilling it on grounds of violation of medical ethics. And just to give an example of that, as I demonstrated in my presentation, it's very, very hard to get the IMA to answer any statement, and not to mention to take steps. When did we see a scurrying to turn and write to reply, to put something out by the IMA on some of the violations? Was when the BMA resolution came out. And how do we know that? Because we have doctors or members of PHRI or have shared with us, or in some cases actually shared it in public, in the media, who have been part of the meetings of the IMA following the BMA and noting what the IMA took from BMA was, we now have a hasbara problem. In other words, we need more, give us, turning to the army and turning to the government and saying we need ammunition, to answer to these things. So we're not there yet. In other words, the IMA is not yet taking the steps that we want, but that's what got them to respond. And we need more of those. We need those kinds of resolutions toward IMA with repercussions.
Thanks, Tepsa. I've got a little note here that Sue Wareham might want to just briefly comment on the cancellation of the Grand Round at the Royal Children's. But I just thought that this might be an opportunity to bring in the Medical Association for Prevention of War, if Sue Wareham is out there.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can.
Oh, good. Okay. First, thanks to all the speakers. It's been absolutely terrific. I won't say much because time is short, but I think most of you in Australia at least are aware that there was to have been a grand round at Royal Children's Hospital in Melbourne on Wednesday in 2 days' time. And it had been planned for some time. The organisers were, the subject was to be children and war The organisers were extremely careful that this would not focus on any particular war zone. It would be about children in war generally, but one cannot talk about children in war these days without talking about the situation in Gaza. So, of course, children in Gaza would have been part of the discussion. What happened late last week, I was to have been one of the presenters. The CEO of the hospital wrote to the presenters and said the whole thing was cancelled. The reason it's coming to light, the reason, well, I can't say absolutely definitely the reason he made that decision. What we do know is that he had received a letter from an organisation called the Australian Alliance Against Anti-Semitism in Healthcare, and maybe some of you we should all be aware of this organisation. They had written to the CEO, and now the whole thing is cancelled. There's been huge outcry about this, as there should be. Over 1,300 emails over the weekend to the CEO about it, and various other statements. So I think, to me, the implication that presumably a discussion of children and war could have gone ahead, but if the issue of Palestinian kids came into it, then it seems that was grounds for cancelling it. I just can't countenance that any human being would think along those lines. Anyway, just two things come out of this in terms of action. We're not going to let this rest with the RCH in Melbourne. They can't get away with cancelling something on children and war. It's beyond outrageous. So we're going to keep going and try to discuss the CEO's concerns, address them, and hopefully go ahead in a more positive fashion. But I think also what would be a good outcome would be if other people in hospitals, teaching hospitals around the country, propose doing something similar, discussions on children war or health and war or whatever, and just make the point, we're not going to be silenced on this. So there we are. I think I might leave it there. Thanks.
Look, thank you very much, Sue. And we'll be watching this space, because I know a lot of people feel strongly about that. Very strongly. There's sorry,
David,
go on.
I'm sorry. Do you mind if I just take this opportunity, just for anybody here who's in Melbourne? I'll put a link in the chat, in the Q&A. There's an event in Melbourne next Monday evening, a week's time, 6:30 p.m. It's in person only, and the subject is Gaza Defending Health Advocacy, hosted by MAPW. So I'll put the link for that in the chat. Thanks. In the Q&A.
Okay. Thank you, Sue. Look, there's a couple of quick comments, but I think Professor Leslie London wanted to make a comment. Is that correct, Professor?
Yeah, so I actually wanted to comment on the idea of the motivation of organizations, but the discussion has sort of gone on, so I just want to add a few suggestions.
Sure.
So we actually published a piece on children at war and solidarity with children, and we had it in our national journal. We had a response from an individual speaking on behalf of an organization, which turns out to have been created in 2025. And if you look at its website, it is basically to combat misinformation, propaganda against Israel, and a few other mental health sort of things thrown in. And it was co-authored by a bunch of other organizations, one of which is an Australian, Australasia Jewish Medical something or another, which brands itself as the Australian branch of the IMA. And globally, there are these organizations, these folks organizations that appear, and I think it's entirely related to the Hasbara budget that Israel has massively ramped up to create these bodies, which create problems for you. So this, I'm not sure what this Australian body is, but I would investigate whether it's a recent creation, and I would suspect it was, and maybe that's a line of research for somebody who has time to do that. The South African Medical Association actually engaged the IMA directly. They had a meeting, and to its credit, it was a critical meeting. In other words, they heard the IMA out, but they knew what was going on. So I would actually suggest a strategy that if NMAs are wanting to be sure that they're not going to be criticized by their membership, they actually meet the IMA and hear all the rubbish that they have to say and put it aside, deal with it. I think that's an important strategy. And then just as far as cancelling a meeting on children, I mean, I don't know if Australia has a child rights approach, but it's clearly signed on to the Children's Rights Convention, and in all matters affecting the child's best interest should come first. And I would, suggest you lobby for that. Just to come back to the why organizations refuse, I agree with Nick that it's many things, but I think we also sometimes forget the problem that actually membership are ordinary people who feel discomforted by what is going on. Many times I've not been sure what the organization thinks, but when you talk to the membership, they're actually not happy that their leadership. It's not always the case. I mean, my experience was quite small, but I would really suggest trying to use strategies such as town hall meetings or votes, to find out. And then it becomes either more difficult for the leadership to put a can on it, or they feel empowered that actually they can say something without being shot down. So there it is, my suggestion.
Thank you very much. Thanks. And before I bring Britt on to chat, I just wanted to read a couple of comments from Georges Barhertz. Pardon the pronunciation, Georges, but I will try reading it anyway. In Belgium, we try to organize a group of Jewish doctors who signed a statement, not in our name, signed by 750 Jews in 24 hours. It can cut a little bit of the accusation of anti-Semitism for every critic of the Israeli politics. And above that, he said, Belgian medical authorities are ready to condemn IDF, but not to condemn the silence of the IMA. Maybe meeting directly witnesses or looking at this webinar would help to change a little bit of their mind. Anyway, I thought they were two useful comments. So thank you very much, Georges. And before I bring out another question, Britt, you wanted to make a comment? I saw that you had your hand up.
Yeah. Just quickly around why we don't take action. I don't know if it's an Australian thing, but I feel as though Australian leadership doesn't love to stick their neck out ahead of a crowd and loves to act collectively. And so I think something that's very powerful is, as you said with the Belgian medical authorities, if everybody moves together, it might be more likely to happen. And the same with the medical colleges as well. And I see there's a attendee who's mentioned about navigating the risks of censorship and threat of suspension. And I would advocate for collective action there as well, because I think when 1,300 people email the RCH CEO, it's very different to a single, I guess, social media post. So collective.
Thanks, Britt. That's very constructive, because you just addressed that question that I was going to about the threat. And I think collective action is really, really important. I think we've only just got a minute or so left. So just in closing, I would like to thank all the people who registered for this webinar and contributed to the support that we're all feeling. But in particular, I would like to thank the 4 speakers. An amazing job. I know how busy we all are, and I know that there is a mental, emotional, and physical energy involved in being available for these types of presentations and to producing the goods. And we're just very grateful that you have all done this and helped enlighten us and help move us all forward. And I'm sure all those Palestinians would appreciate the effort that we're putting in, and long may it continue. Certainly, I feel motivated after listening to the speakers. And perhaps we're leaving footprints for other people to actually follow in and contribute to making a change. But I don't know if it's the impatience of youth. I don't think that applies to me, but I feel impatient that changes needed to be made in our colleges and medical institutions much quicker than they're happening at the moment. So thank you all very much. And also one more thing, I'd just like to thank Mairead Heaney from Perth Doctors Medical Aid for Palestine, who does an amazing amount of work behind the scenes and coordinated all of this, and that very kindly handed it over to me. So thank you very much, Mairead. And thank you everybody for attending.